Well, Happy New Year. Almost. Almost. One more day. We almost didn't come to Springwood. Don't know if you know that. You may or may not know that it was actually the third official place that we were called to. And after leading 4 churches in Canada and doing chaplaincy for 3 schools, the last 2 of which were in Adelaide, as you likely know, we moved to Avondale and I pursued my PhD for 4 years. And towards the end of my study, we were somewhat stressed, as we didn't know where God was going to put us. I thought having a doctorate would have made it easier, but surprisingly, my doctorate made it harder to find ministry work. In September of 2019, I was invited to be the academic dean of 3 schools at Pacific Adventist University in Papua New Guinea. And it was a really cool offer as an academic, but I said no, as we did not believe it would be a good place for my family. And that was in October when we finally made that decision. And it wasn't until December that we heard anything else. And that was a stressful time, those 8 weeks of not hearing anything. We then got a call to a beautiful rural pastorate in South New South Wales, but having already spent time in a rural district, we were praying about it. I was a bit unsure. We were going to take it, and then a friend of mine from Sydney told me about this church in Brisbane that was trying to find someone to fill an associate pastor role. It seemed to fit our needs more, and the timing seemed like it was from God. So I called the church number, and this guy with an Eastern European accent answered the phone. Most of you would know that that man was Mladen, the then outgoing associate. And he gave me Kendall's number, and I called him, and we got on really well. And well, the rest, you probably know the rest. We came here. And that was just over 3 years ago, and ironically, 3 years later, I've seen the whole pastoral team change. I got 1.5 years with Kendall. I got a few handfuls of time with Caitlin in between all the maternity leaves. And I got 1 year with Paul. And our family thought we'd be here for a while. But the thing that never seems to change in ministry is change, even when you're not ready for it. 6 weeks ago, I took my last worship for the Leadership Council. They didn't know it was going to be my last worship, but I had a feeling it was. And I reflected on Micah 6:8 as a way of looking back and looking forward for our church. And Micah 6:8 reads, "O people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you, to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." I think it's a verse that should both judge and govern our decisions as leaders and as Christians, really. We like to quote it a lot, but I don't think we really wrestle with it much. So today I'd like you to reflect on it, and reflect on it as we look back over 2022, and also look at it in anticipation of 2023. And as for the bulk of my sermon, I'm going to go with the Apostle Paul's method when he wrote to churches. I almost called the sermon Joe's Epistle to Springwood, but I thought, no, people might take that the wrong way. But I basically followed his method. So this is what his method tended to be. I'll talk a bit about what has been accomplished through God, what's to be commended here in our time together. I'll spend a bit with some advice and counsel as to some things that I think you need to think about. and I'll finish with some encouragement going forward into 2023 and beyond. First, what's to be commended? Well, 6 weeks after we arrived, COVID happened and changed everything. It's only really been the last year, really, that our family has actually seen what Springwood is actually like without COVID. And ironically, for better or worse, COVID was the underlying stress for our accomplishments that God used for our good. No one liked COVID, but there were things that God used COVID to bring good. And they were most of the things that I'm going to be mentioning. First off, when COVID hit and everyone became isolated, as a church, we all began to work towards bringing more structure and administration to our community. There wasn't really much of that looking back. We went from just a list of leaders on a PDF to thinking about how everyone interacted as leaders and ministers, and we started the process of creating an ever-changing document regarding the infrastructure of Springwood. And because of that, I think that we actually do things better when it comes to ministry. COVID helped us to go beyond a list of names to asking hard questions about how ministry was actually taking place at Springwood, how ministry should take place, and who is responsible for the different areas of ministry. Instead of just a monthly council meeting, the pastoral team, along with the elders, the lead elders, began meeting as an advisory team on a weekly basis to help navigate the constantly changing landscape of ministering during COVID. So the first thing to be commended, Springwood, is I think we can be thankful for, with God's help in the past few years, as we've actually become more functional administratively. The second thing I want to commend us on a church is related to what I said before. We've actually become more digital. Have you noticed? And not just as a church, as individuals. Wow. I mean, again, this is in part thanks to COVID. Before COVID, there were quite a few people, particularly regarding those above the age of 50, who avoided technology as though it was a plague. But then when the real plague came, well, I don't think most of our seniors could say that a few years ago they would be as tech savvy as they are now. Good job. I mean, we now have seniors who only do digital attendance now. They actually, we don't see them, but they actually watch, and they're watching right now. They watch every week. They go to Sabbath school on Zoom every week. Some of them who said that they would never, ever get used to streaming or Zoom, that's now, they do it more than I do. We also got Springwood onto Elvanto, which was a church administrative software program, so we could actually plan and communicate with the leaders and know who attends and needs a visit. We really went from functioning as though we were in the 1990s to, well, the 2010s. We're not quite where we could be. But that's quite a ways. But the third and biggest thing to commend, an accomplishment that sums up, is that we survived. That sounds like a cop-out, but with God's grace, think about it. We survived as a church the biggest threat medically, socially, mentally, and spiritually that society has experienced in at least 60, 70 years. Before the holiday period started a month or so ago, we were pretty close to pre-COVID levels when it came to attendance. That's amazing compared to a year before, and especially a year before that. I don't know how many people who didn't have a hard time in some way in the last year or the last 3 years or 4 years, particularly in the last couple with COVID. But I know a lot of people who were hit really hard by that. And I commend you for getting through that by God's grace. Personally, our family got put through a grinder last year, the stress of 2020, it was 2021 last year, but the stress of 2020 was starting to catch up with me. And last year it started to hit even more when Kendall took a call to Port Macquarie. We went from 3 pastors in 2020 down to 1.5 in the last half of last year. And I didn't realize how hard last year, 2021, was for me personally until in the first half of this year when I experienced burnout and long COVID at the same time. Don't recommend either, especially not together. It's not a good mix. If you didn't see me much between April and July, it was because I spent most of the time trying to recover. In case you didn't know that. And yes, mental health and depression and stress and all that stuff, it affects everyone. It's not just you need to connect to God more. It's just a human reality on a sinful planet. So if you've had stuff that happened with that doesn't mean that it's your fault. I was exhausted physically from long COVID and mentally from all the stress. And to be honest, it was a very frightening experience for both me and my family. And no one will know how much my wife actually did for this church. You will not ever know how much she actually did for this church, because if it was not for her, I probably would have said bye a while ago. Pastors' spouses never get the credit that they deserve. And I know, like I said, I wasn't the only one who suffered in the last 3 years, and there's many who are still suffering. Many on our leadership team had terrible things happen to them just in the last year and in the last 3 years. And many others in the Springwood community also have had terrible things take place. The fact that we made it through and we've held on to our faith and onto each other, that's to be commended. That's a huge accomplishment. So well done, Springwood. Now, in following Paul's epistles, the Apostle Paul, not Pastor Paul, let me gently give some counsel and advice as someone who's leaving the post. I can just say stuff and I'll be gone, so it should be fine, right? First, some counsel regarding giving. Oh, I said it. A pastor's actually talking about finances. There are some here who give a ridiculous amount of money to help our ministries function and to keep this place running. And these people usually shy away from getting any credit for this. And that's commendable. But it appears as though many of us rely on other people to give offering. And that's wrong. I'll just say it. I know times are hard financially, believe me, I know. But if every adult would just give the equivalent of what you would spend on one medium hot drink of your choice when you go to a cafe, or what you'd spend on one smoothie, or what you'd spend on a piece of cake at a shop, something I know 99% of the population does. If everyone just gave that once a week, we would not be struggling anywhere near what we are at Springwood. And yes, we probably look like we are the richest church, but I know churches of 20 who have more financial stuff going for them. We are struggling at Springwood, and I'm going out, so you can't say I'm saying this just to save my job. We're struggling at this church. Did you know that if things continue as they do at Springwood, you'll lose this facility in 3 years? Let that sink in. That's how bad it is. The few times people have gotten up here to cautiously encouraged people because everyone was like, oh, people get really upset about it. They were not being overdramatic. No one likes to get bills, but if you ignore your bills, what happens? You get kicked out. If anything, the people who came up here did not stress it enough. If you ignore your bills, you get kicked out of your house. I know people don't like it when someone up the front brings up giving money, and I've been told, oh no, pastors should never talk about it. A couple hours, I'm not going to be your pastor anymore, so it doesn't matter. In a couple hours, I will not have any ties financially to this church. But the reality is, just like your own bills, if the church's bills do not get paid, the church will be kicked out of their place. And the thing is, it's not just about the place. We're using almost all of our money just to pay the bills for this. Do you know what that means? It means we can't do ministry here. So for those who said this church should be doing more ministry, we can't because we're trying to pay the electricity. So to those who do give a medium cup of coffee or whatever a week, thank you. But to those who don't, please, it's not much, but it's necessary. I could say more on this topic, but my advice as I leave is don't assume someone else is doing what God calls each of us to do. Even though I'm leaving Springwood, I still love this place and the people here, and I don't want this community to die, so please prayerfully consider my words. My next piece of advice: as you walk into the new year, followers of Jesus grow in their walk with him and others. That means we need to spend time with God personally and put an effort into learning how to be the person who God calls each of us individually to be. God accepts us where we are, but he doesn't expect us to just be stagnant. When I arrived here, I was told, Springwood doesn't do seminars. I was told people will not attend anything outside of Sabbath worship. You know, I get it. It's busy. It's busy during the week. We're all busy. It's hard when you have kids. It's hard when you are married. It's hard when you're pursuing a career. It's hard when you're retired. Well, life is hard. But followers of Jesus grow. When are you making time for spiritual growth? We can't expect things to get better spiritually or the church to become better if we don't better ourselves through Christ. Coming here for an hour or two a week, that's not enough. It's like putting a drop of water on a flower for a whole week and thinking it's going to be fine. Jesus says, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age. How can this possibly happen if the only thing we do is sit in a chair for an hour and a half each week? Please consider my words of counsel. When the leadership team puts workshops on, when you're invited to life groups, go to them. Do something. Finally, my last piece of counsel to you, Springwood Church. 1 Corinthians 1:10, Paul writes, I appeal to you, dear brothers and sisters, by the authority of our Lord Jesus Christ, to live in harmony with each other. Let there be no divisions in the church. Rather be of one mind, united in thought and purpose. I've never been to a church where there wasn't any conflicts, because we're all humans. It's what humans do. We excel at that, don't we? But regardless of the different opinions people have of how ministry should happen, and what spaces in ministry we should have, we are commanded to work together for the sake of Jesus. All too often, we often put our individual opinions, emotions, and past experiences on a higher level than the mission that God has given us as Christians. And, I can't work with them because da-da-da-da-da. Or I'm not going to listen to them because of whatever. That's putting our opinions on a higher level than what God has asked us to do. I do it too. We all do this. But I'm advising and counseling that we need to try to find ways to keep ourselves anchored to what God has asked us to do. We should not allow our pride to stop us from doing what God has asked us to do as individuals and as a community. If we are followers of Jesus, we need to acknowledge our personal issues. We need to stop thinking it's all someone else's issue. It's not. We all have things that we do. We need to seek forgiveness, not just talk about forgiveness. We need to seek forgiveness. We need to forgive others. And where possible, we need to reconcile with one another. If there's someone in the church that you have an issue with, yeah, it's really hard. It stinks, but that's what earth is like. You can't get any more biblical than that. It's Christianity 101. Every person who is a Christian has a mission, and we need to find ways to unite as a community, not find new reasons to divide ourselves and find reasons to not work with each other on things. I'll just leave it there for you to chew on. Finally, the negative stuff is over. Some final encouragement. Just as Paul would always finish his letters, he would encourage. I want to give encouragement both as you look forward to the new year, and I want to give you encouragement as you reflect on the last. This is God's church. It's not my church or your church. It's God's church. It's our church, plural. And as long as you keep Jesus as your Lord and Savior, He will lead this church. Listen to His voice. Be His hands and feet, His eyes and ears. Don't be like most people out there who think just about what they can get out of something. You don't come to church to get something. Don't be consumers of ministry. Be producers, facilitators, and conduits of ministry. That's what God has called you to. We all have times where we do need to get something. But if that's all that's happening, let me encourage you, you all have something amazing to give. Let Jesus live in your heart. You'll hear God's voice because you are His children. God has promised a great inheritance for His children. You have a great inheritance. In 2023 and beyond, as it says in Micah, seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Finally, Springwood, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause His face to shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up His face to you and give you peace.